Good evening. I know you were surprised to see me again, 2 days back to back. Well, that's just what it is over here at Noman. Thank you for coming for another fantastic Noman live stream. If you're looking for closed captionings, go ahead and head over to our Facebook or our YouTube. And I just want to take a quick second here to thank our sponsors. Wait, hang on. I can do this right here. Dell and NVIDIA. Without them, we wouldn't be able to provide you with such amazing content as you're about to watch right now. Now, as we always do it this time, sorry, I had to throw in a little music reference there. If you've seen these streams, if you know me, if you've heard me talk about anything, whenever we have one of these fun live streams, you might have a takeaway that first and foremost, I'm a little bit of a nerd. And secondly, I really, really enjoy graphic novels. I grew up reading a lot of graphic novels, and that's something that never left me. I really, really enjoy them for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons why is the unique stories that are written in graphic. For a lot of reasons that I won't go into right now, generally people that write graphic novels or comic books, they have a lot more freedom than people that can, make movies or things along those lines. And it's really interesting watching that transition, right? From something that you love reading to something that you're going to watch. And it's an even better transition when you transition from something that you love reading to something that you love watching. And today, I think we are going to talk to somebody that really was integral in that transition, because today we're talking about Nimona. And in case you don't know about Nimona, Nimona is based on the Nimona, the movie, is based on an award-winning graphic novel by ND Stevenson. Nimona tells a story of a knight who is framed for a crime he didn't commit, and the only person who can help him prove his innocence is Nimona, a shape-shifting teen who might also be a monster he's sworn to kill. I'm reading it off of here because I didn't want to give my own little spin on it in case I spoiled anything, but no spoilers from the intro. And I think that's it. I think that's all I have to say about it, because I, like you, really want to just sit and watch and really, really just take in everything that we're about to see. So without further ado, the production designer on Nimona, Aidan Sugano.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here with you guys today. So I mean, I figured with this the most interesting thing that I could share would be to show you and walk you through our internal style guide deck that we use to design literally everything in the entire film and how we did it step by step. For every single visual choice to what we were talking about translating the graphic novel, which was the most complicated thing, because obviously we wanted to stay as true to it as possible, but in the translation from book to screen, there's a lot of different ways you can skin that cat. And so for us, it became a very big challenge, and then add on top of it the goal that we wanted to approach this very, very hyper stylized look, and the big journey that was started 7 years ago, which was way back in a different era at this point, where we didn't have things like Arcane and Spider-Verse was being devved at the same time and all of that. So it was a journey, but
and it has been. And are you for you personally, that kind of challenge, was it something that you kind of looked forward to, or were you looking at it and going like, I have no idea how I'm going to approach this?
Oh, I mean, both, easily both. Yeah, it was. I mean, it was definitely one of those projects that, like, as soon as it came across the desk, you were like, all right, I'm gonna chop off every single one of my limbs because I have to fucking work on that project. And luckily luckily I got to, and then I got to see it from 2016 all the way to here, where it was like I was actually luckily enough able to touch one of the first couple pieces of concept art, and then all the way through to now, which has been a crazy thing. But yeah, I can show you some of that.
Yep. I'm
That's the
excited
kind
to
of
jump
process.
into
Yeah.
it. I just want to let everybody know watching at home, if you have any questions, make sure that you put them in the chat. We'll log them to the side, and then we can also, dive into questions at certain parts during the presentation as well. So don't be shy. You can ask your questions. I have a bunch of questions too. So the least amount of questions that you submit means that I get to ask more questions. But I'm always going to side on the side of y'all's questions. So please go ahead and put them in the chat at any point in time during the stream, and we'll make sure to log those. Aidan, the floor is yours.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So when we knew that we had to translate this awesome graphic novel by Nate, like it very quickly became clear that there were so many different avenues that we could go through, but the thing that resonated more than anything was the spirit at the core of this graphic novel that so many people connected to. And so that kind of became our guiding light from a both a visual standpoint and a story standpoint of trying to marry the visuals to the story in a way that can best express the story, since animation is a visual medium. And so the thing that we kind of use as the guiding force for everything was the theme. And the theme of this was kind of our statement that we used for the entire film as a kind of touchstone that we would always go back to, which again, it talks about acceptance, but it also hints at the piece of perception and bias and expectation and all of that that's wrapped into this very complex narrative. And so this was a way of kind of aligning every visual choice that we had to give a reason behind why we were making every visual choice. And so we broke this down into every single aspect, from character design to the base language to render style to how we accomplished our surfacing and our environments, and that blade of grass in the background and what angle it needed to be at. And the biggest thing was making sure that, since this theme is so much about perception and expectation, and we wanted to go after um, this very nostalgic 2D look, we wanted to actually use it as a way to kind of hold up that mirror to all of the things that we had grown up to in regards to the 2D things that have defined all of our childhoods and all of that, and then turn it on its head in the spirit of Nimona. Um, and try to have that visual metaphor come through. And so, obviously, one of the first places that we needed to look was our source material and what defined that kind of golden era of animation that we all kind of touched on, especially as it related to this kind of strange juxtaposition of fantasy and futuristic, medieval future that Nate had in his graphic novel, which was the coolest thing ever, because the that's that space that every single one of us wants to play with, because it's like you get to do magic and dragons and lasers and monsters and knights and armor and flying cars and shit. And so it was like, on top of the fact that every single one of us connected so strongly to the story. And so very quickly we realized that kind of two artists stood out in this kind of touchstone. Um, and one of them was Ivan Earl, which classically gave us obviously Sleeping Beauty and all of those early kind of golden era Disney films that defined that very look of the high fantasy of 2D animation. And then a contemporary, which was Charlie Harper. And by marrying these two artists and kind of using them as our kind of foundational touchstones, to set the groundwork of what this base 2D look could be, we had the range to push and play and open this up even farther. Because, what we quickly found was a lot of the visual rules that both of them leaned into, as soon as you start translating them into 3D, uh, they just don't work, right? When you have someone like Charlie Harper, who bases so much of his shape language off of like rigid geometric shapes, or even when he goes organic, they're very clean, and they're very I mean, graphic is the easiest way of saying it. As soon as you start turning that in space, it becomes a challenge to maintain some of the same things that we're doing. And so, first and foremost, we had to define what those tenets that defined both of these styles were. And so, we analyzed the crap out of everything, and a few very iconic things started coming out, right? Some of this was the simple geometry of how they're basing all their shapes. Um, they also, we realized that they were organizing everything off of a simple grid. So every angle was either organized off of a mathematical grid where they lock two very specific angles and that is it. Um, or sometimes he did the opposite and had a grid, but it was much more of an implied grid that felt a little bit more organic, but still had a very clear sense of landmark angles that could not be ignored and were kind of defined everything. And it even boiled down to how they handled curves, right? So curves would be very, very geometric and um, almost like compass driven, right? Where only a few types of curves were used for a specific illustration. And so these, again, when you start to think of this in the 3D sphere, start to get really challenging, because as soon as you have characters that need to emote and perform, um, having certain shapes can be extremely limiting if you need them to be super pushed. And so we had to figure out what these laws were, and then figure out later, and I'll show you that, how we could break them or how we could use them and design them in the 3D space. Um, and another thing that we very much wanted to lean into was the repetition. And this went a lot against kind of all of the stuff that we've been taught, or at least I'd been taught, where leaning into some things like tangents. Tangents is always a bad word, but tangents are utilized huge in so many of these illustrations to create the sense of rhythm. And same with repetition, where there's one single shape that gets repeated over and over, but based on how it's repeated and based on the size variation or the color variation, it feels so organic and feels so true to the simple, boiled down caricature of what that naturalistic and specific naturalistic thing was. And so that was something that we really, really wanted to hang on to. Um, and then, of course, a very heavy emphasis on rhythm, which this was a big one that kind of drove everything and eventually would go into performance with the animators, but where designs could be almost drawn in one single fluid line. So where if you look at the partridge up in the left hand corner, you can start that drawing in one side and go through the entire drawing and end at the end point and have done that entire drawing with one single stroke. And so trying to find a way to imply those same kind of powerful rhythms in uh, the 3D space then became the challenge. Um, and so all of this again was in service of that theme and making sure that we set up the convention and the expectation of all of the expectations we all had around the 2D, classic 2D fantasy look, so that then we could throw it on its head later. Um, and so we kind of went back to our basics with how we were going to apply each of these elements into the 3D sphere. And so we needed to really kind of separate out what each of these things was doing specifically, so that then we could make sure to apply it in the right way because back then too, we didn't have all of the tools that I think are at our disposal now for the hyper stylized looks that you're seeing come out, right? And we also had a budget, realistically. And so we had to figure out a way of building so much of this thinking in to every layer of the process so that it couldn't be, because we knew it couldn't be a filter that was applied at the end. It had to work at the core foundational elements and then push its way all the way through. And so, there was the editorialization piece, where we our goal was to simplify things down to the barest expression of what that actual specific element was. And then, of course, was applying the style, which in this case was looking back to that Charlie Harper, that Ivan Earl, that classic 2D sphere, and then the caricaturization, because again, there's so much spirit and energy in Nate's original graphic novel that we needed to maintain, and staying rigidly adhering to the graphic shapes of the source material didn't embrace that spirit and showcase it in the way that it needed to. And so we needed to combine all of these elements. Um, and so what we kind of landed on in the very beginning was this idea of the law of simplicity. And for us, this meant that in a simple way, we were going to boil everything down to the simplest, clearest expression of the idea. So if it was a curve, or it felt kind of like it needed to be a curve, make it a curve. If it was it felt like it was a flat plane, then we simplified it out to a flat plane. If it felt so subtle that you didn't even feel it, then we blasted it away entirely. Or the opposite, if it was bold, then we made it even more bold, or we made it harder, or we made it stronger. And this went from base design to our modeling, like you see with the Queen up there, where even in our sculpts, we were looking for areas that we could simplify the overall geometry so that our base light shapes inherently could be appealing even in the rest pose, so that when we started emoting, when we started moving, they would maintain that appeal. And then it went to lighting, of course, and render and composition and everything else. And so we kind of boiled it down to a few basic global design language cues. Obviously, most of these are fundamental: big, medium, small, strong line of action, uh, you know, uh, straight versus curve. And then there were a few things that started to come out that we knew that were speaking directly to the language. So, avoiding some angles, or treating how we did curves in a very specific way. We called it the pipe bend, but it was basically where you still have straights implied, but the curve was a very kind of almost geometric curve that when you lit it, it simplified down into a very clean shape. And then we also knew that we had to build in the ideologies that existed. So much of the graphic novel power came from this kind of dichotomy between the good and the bad, and in this case, our institute, which represented non-acceptance, and Nimona, which represented change and fluidity and acceptance. And so making sure that those two languages were very, very visually distinct. And so with everything in the institute, it became rigid. It became architectural. It was up and down. It was side to side. It was only these two grids. Everything in the institute and institute related was designed either at a 60-degree grid or a 45-degree grid. So all angles matched that. Even in 3D space, as things started to turn, they would have to make sure that they maintained that. And then built on the icon and the idea of the sword. So since this is supposed to elicit and use the trope of these classic heroes, and have those be the thing that all of us think, oh, it's the good guys, right? They're the good guys in this space, but in the graphic novel, it's the opposite. And in our film, it was also the case. And so making sure that we leaned very much into all of those classic hero tropes. So the tall, lofty, ethereal white knight, gleaming marble, gleaming armor, gold, um, and then having the opposite, obviously, the villains be everything about change and fluidity and curves and organic and uneven and asymmetrical and leaning into the opposite so that we could really ground both of those languages. Um, and we can skip this because it's just about lines. But everything in every line in our film only used these 3 lines for anything that was a visual line because, well, actually, I'm not going to skip this. Sorry. Because we were going so illustrative with it, we knew that we wanted to base things off of the physical properties so that it wouldn't trick your brain and feel odd. We wanted to very much lean into a caricatured version of the natural physics that your brain wants to see. So for, obviously we were flattening everything out, but for occlusion, when we had deformation, when shapes came together, and we needed a hard line. We didn't want to have occlusion in there because it would overly complicate the space. And so we replaced it with a crease line, and every crease line could only be one of these 3 lines that turned on to imply the deformation that we needed it to. And this went to, raindrops and lens flares and, lines in our materials, all of that. And so the next step of this is obviously trying to figure out how to design to that 3D grid. So what we did was we identified what areas were hard edged and were not going to change, and then what were the areas of deformation that we knew were going to change. And we built the grid in to all of the elements in a way that even when they deformed, you would still have your landmark areas reflect the grid. So on Ballister's face, his nose bridge, his cheekbones, his temples, the side of his chin, his facial hair, all of those lined up to align with that grid. So at every angle you could go, you would always get those parallels. You would always get that repetition, and you'd always get that rhythm to line up. And we even did that with the hair as well on Nimona and most of our characters, where if you were to able to draw rhythm lines through it, the tangents would actually line up and flow into each other and create different shapes, even in the 3D space as you started to turn around. And this is just another example of how to think of that in the environment, right? Where you could use those tangents to actually illustrate the division between different items, rock versus grass versus clumps of trees, and then finding a way to simplify them down into the purest expression of that so that they still read exactly as that, but could flatten out into the detail that we needed it to be. And then we also had this other huge ask, which was, the combination of evolving the medieval into the future, which, it was really difficult because our world right now is an evolution of the medieval. And so you actually, as soon as you start to look around, you start to see elements that are directly taken from 12th century Britain or 10th century France, and so this became a exercise in leaning into the icon and the perception of what we all thought of as medieval in this kind of classic high fantasy sphere, and then how we can utilize those to and flip them on their heads to give you not a caricatured, not a theme park version, but a grounded version of what the medieval future would be. So, leaning into how could you make um, maintain a medieval silhouette, but use a hoodie or use, a contemporary piece of athleisure wear, right? Or use chainmail to imply, um, different things. And so we were leaning into the medieval silhouette, but putting it into the contemporary design sphere. And then we were also saying the opposite, which is borrow a piece of the medieval and use it into the contemporary space. So, taking the quilting on a gambeson and making it into a piece of outerwear, or uh, putting certain elements, bracers, that kind of things, onto garments in either a high fashion or a fast casual fashion way. And this was not only in fashion, but this was in the environment, and this was in the uh, like city design and city planning and all of that. Sorry, my brain just stopped right there. Um, and so all of these kind of started to boil first through our characters. Um, and like everything else, they became heavily based on expressing the ideal shape languages of each of those ideologies, and then having those be the icons that carried us through the entirety of the film. So Nimona became the flame. Everything around her was based off of that. Ballister became the shield, um, because of who he was as a character. Golden Loin became the sword, and the director became the arch, because she not only was supposed to be the kind of the pillar of this ideology and the pillar of the kingdom, but she is the villain. So arch and all of that, and that was not intended. I guarantee. I just realized this right now as we were talking. Um, and so to take those further, and to maintain the simplicity and maintain the graphic nature, we had to think again about all things. So making sure that if we wanted to express strong rhythms, how to express those in every form of animation. So simplifying things down where cloth um, would only flow out on one side, and biasing it to a extremely simple expression on the other, or looking for where the line of action was and could be expressed in the exterior form. Um, and then we started to have to think about how to express this in every single aspect. So, how do you simplify into this flat sphere, but still have it perform in the correct way that your brain wants it to feel in regards to naturalistic hair? How do you design that space? How do you design the highlight around that? And it was all based on going back to the fundamentals and leaning into designing it in that simple, plainer way. So, um, the we clumped our hair into big, medium, small. We had our flyaways and the base movement define and give us most of the performance, and then we built tools that and broke our system completely, and re-engineered it from scratch, that would give you a highlight that would perform like natural but have an extremely graphic quality to it, and maintain the directionality that your brain would need in an anisotropic lighting situation, like on hair, like on fur. And then we also leaned on looking back at how other illustrators would have treated this in the past. Um, and then this also leaned into how we thought of the entire frame as a whole. So because we knew we wanted to do this hypergraphic style, we knew that as details receded into the distance, um, they would actually build up in complexity, because things would get smaller and things would get subpixel, and would actually make it feel more 3D, even though it was staying exactly the same. And so not only to make sure that from an overall compositional space, it felt like the entire frame of the film was painted with the same brush. We actually designed stuff to get simpler as they receded into the distance, to the point of simple geometric shapes, where all of a sudden the head of a character could literally just be a circle on top of a square, but at that scale, it felt supernaturalistic. And this also reflected our theme beautifully, because again, it was a way to say, as things got closer, that's when you actually started to see what they really were, not the idea of what we all kind of assume them to be, which again speaks back to the theme of the graphic novel and the theme of our film. Um, and also had to go of making sure that that same level of detail worked all the way up to extreme close-ups, and how to build that in a way that would not add detail into this space in a way that would break it and make it feel inconsistent with the style. Um, and so we also had to design the world. And the first place we started was obviously the background characters, because we knew from the beginning that since we had to make this world feel very grounded and real, um, it it when you go outside and walk around, there's everyone is not wearing the same thing. Everyone is not the gray man is what I call it, where there's two ways to approach PG characters in my mind. Whereas there's the gray man approach where everyone is designed so boring or simple that your leads stand out against them. But that didn't feel genuine to the world that we live in and the world that we are creating. And so we wanted to make sure that we created a crowd that was so rich that our characters felt like they blended in to this space, and you could pull out a character from this and they would have their own story, they would have their own history. And this made us think of our characters in an entirely different way, and in a lot of ways it's very much um, the video game, design your own character creator space, where we wanted to make sure to give the power to everyone to be able to design this entire kingdom that needed to feel like a place where for generations, countless people, generations had lived and died and loved and had all of these histories in this space and could live beyond our characters, of Nimona and Ballister and our leads. And so we first approached it by a very anthropological approach, where we sat down and said, if this world was to actually evolve in a cloistered setting behind these walls from the medieval in this kind of fear-based world, how would society evolve from the medieval rules, and how would that work? So we researched the medieval rules and found that there was the distinction between, nobility and citizenry, and then non-citizens. And so that was a good place to start for us to say, of how do we organize this massive pool and system of crowd characters, but in a gettable way that also relates to our story and expresses this world that we're doing. So we broke it down into a contemporary ideology, where our our nobility was much more based on haute couture rules, where they were simple, they were bold, they were evolution of the kind of royal colors and sumptuary laws that the medieval had, but in a modern take. And same with the citizens, where we leaned more into broader scope, where we needed to have the ability to have business wear and athleisure, and the color palettes that would be associated with those, the range of body types that you would need, and the range of races and ethnicities. And even though it was built in a cloistered space, um, it was it was a mandate of ours from the beginning, for all of us, that we wanted this is to make sure that it was colorblind in this setting. And so, this is the fantasy world that we all want to live in. Well, without all of the prejudice and all of that, obviously, that is in our film as a purposeful. But yeah. And so we needed to make sure to build all of that in. And so we built a system of rules, and then had our amazing crowd team actually write an insane tool that would take these rules and populate them into this space, and group them and rearrange garments in this very specific way. So where the first test of this that we did was 26 million unique variations that we got out of it for the first time. which was immediately amazing for us because then we were just like, oh, great. Well, we have a crowd of people that live in this kingdom. And they were all based off of our rule set, but also every single one of them was unique. And we also had to obviously design this back to the medieval rules because there was a flashback to make things more complicated. And not only did we base this on color, but we also set this up for every step to make this feel as genuinely a reflection of our current world as possible. So you look around and, there's patterns, there's graphics, there's, all prints, all of these, there's textures, different elements. And so we wanted to make sure to build a system that said all of those would be on this as well. So you could have all over prints and jacquards and uh, embroidery and screen printing and graphic tees and all of these different elements that needed to be in there to ground this whole universe and make it feel rich and again beyond our characters. And so we had pattern rules that were filtered into this tool as well that said you could only use these kind of patterns in this kind of amount for these specific groups of nobility or citizen or non-citizen. And then have that populate itself out. And so, one of the other rules is based on the medieval rules of, what it would be like to be a non-citizen in a medieval setting. Obviously their access to certain things would be limited, right? So, for some of this, it became, well, we're only going to use natural dyes or a color palette that feels like it comes from natural dyes for the non-citizens, whereas the nobility and the citizens would have access to much more pigment because it was a reflection of that medieval evolution from sumptuary laws. And then village again. And so here was a few examples of the kind of pattern kit that we designed to also align even at this granular level with our base style. And our crowd characters had to function in that same simplification at distance space. And so we called this level of style, but basically it was, as the characters got farther into the distance, they got simpler. And so we needed to make sure that the same amount of richness could also exist in the teeny tiny little crowd that needs to be, a mile back. And then we had to build the world. So this was the funnest place to play in because Nate had given us this amazing medieval dystopian future and this perfect visual metaphor of medieval future where again it is the future. It is like our world right now, but it is grounded in backwards thinking and the medieval thinking that still exists in our world today. And so how to build a space that can showcase that, but also showcase it in a way that it falls into the background. And so very quickly, we realized that the one thing that we wanted to make sure that it expressed was the idea of time. If you look out your windows, right, there's like buildings that were built in the 70s. There are buildings that were built 100 years ago. There's buildings that were built 200 years ago. There's construction that's happening right now. And they're all different architectural styles. They're all different architectural statements. And so making sure that that kind of thinking, but kept within this cloistered community, would express itself in the same way so that we could express time without actually saying it and instead show it. And so, we set a few rules. So, we could take a medieval element like a crenellation on a tower and put it on a modern building. We could, scale up a piece of an iconic thing into a huge, massive, apartment complex where a wattle and daub house or a Krupp house could be all of a sudden a huge, huge, huge skyscraper, or we could make a castle out of glass, or we could also showcase the kind of neoclassicism version of this, where it'd be like, because there's so much emphasis and tradition in this space, We needed to make sure that they would still lean into those very classic elements that they prided themselves in and the tradition that was so important in this kingdom. And so we had just castles show up. Um, and then we also wanted to make sure that it felt like it was designed organically, because from our research, it was cool that we found out that like medieval cities, they didn't have city planners. Obviously, they grew organically, and they grew in a way that was dictated by the need of the citizens inside that space. So there was a cool rule that we found where it's like all main thoroughfares had to be wide enough where two riders with lances held horizontal could easily maneuver through them. And if any piece of a building touched the tip of a lance, they would just cut off that piece of the building so that it could be an open thoroughfare. They wouldn't destroy the building. They would literally just carve out a piece of that. And so we took those kind of ideas and built this city so that elements would lean, be built on top of things or hanging over things or organized in this very dense and claustrophobic way that would reflect how this city would actually evolve into this sphere in the modern landscape. And so these were a few of our examples of designing the different kind of neighborhoods or boroughs of this kingdom so that we could have, the shopping district or the central avenue or the more kind of, modern areas look one way, the high-end financial districts, with their huge skyscrapers of glass and, steel beams and all of that be uh, very much separated from that, and then very clearly and this is a place that we called the danks internally, but any places where was on the more lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, they would be leaning into much more of the older technology, the older sphere, the older materials, but still in this tonally correct area, and make them feel very different. And that even went down to what materials we specifically used for each group. So, for most of the city, we limited our palettes, and we set our same rules because we also built a modular city system, kind of like we did with the background characters. And it was designed by the tool and in a modular fashion. So, only certain types of woods were used, only certain types of stone and cement and glass, and same for the other side. Only certain types of materials were used for each, and in certain rule sets. So making sure that the contrast stayed within a certain range, saturation stayed within a certain range, the cleanliness stayed within a certain range. Because again, we wanted to make sure that we could express time without specifically pointing it out and calling attention to it. So you felt it but didn't see it. And we went into we had papers and papers and pages of docs that were just like writing down, well, in this situation, how would the city have evolved in regards to the topography of the specific alpine area that we got really, really fucking nerdy with it. And it was fun because that's a space where I like to play in, but we probably could get a dissertation and a master's thesis on some of these for sure. But yeah, we had to consider space, and also we had to consider like what would be the vernacular architecture. Is this based off of a wide range of medieval, or is this based on a small range in medieval? And very quickly, it kind of became apparent that the classic 2D voice of the classic 2D fantasy very much it was isolated to kind of like the 11th or the 10th to 12th century in kind of, Britain, Germany, France, Europe piece of is what was iconic in the medieval future for this specific. And so we kind of leaned into that as our vernacular architecture starting point. And then, like everything, we had to think about the culture, right? So how would the culture of this have evolved, and how would it express itself in a simple way in the background, right? What kind of graphics, what kind of elements, what kind of art, what kind of architecture, what kind of pop culture would exist in the sphere, and how would it be shown? And so this is actually one of our earlier look dev tests of starting to build this and starting to apply some of the look. I think we did this in 2017, but also making sure that we needed it to feel grounded and rich, but also start to hint at that holistic approach of the look, and the hint at the culture and the grounded nature. And so one way that we broke down culture is we asked ourselves, how would the cloistered aspect and the fear that existed of these monsters outside of this wall that is so important to this film, how would that actually hang over the citizens of this space, and how would it be expressed? And so it came down to kind of the infrastructural and then the socio element. And so, there was the pieces of art and art installations, and there was the propaganda that would be showcased there. Um, and then there would be obviously the pop culture element of it. So this lent ourselves all the way down to, graffiti and bus stop ads, right? If you see something, slay something. And, the soft drink ads, or pieces of art, newspapers, all of that. And then also how it would express itself in the non-propaganda sphere, but into the more pop culture space. So leaning into the dragon and the monster, and how that would showcase itself through things like Monster Burger, which was one of my favorite ones, where whoops, in the upper right hand corner, their version of what this Monster Burger would be, kind of lame, yeah. Um, um, but having this be this very, very strong range, so that we could pepper this around this world and have the different levels and different strengths of this ideology showcase itself in a way that was felt and not seen, or felt and not seen, and you could feel it as you watch this without actually having uh, it called out in an exposition type way. Yeah, and I love these too. This was done by the motion graphics team at DNEG, and they came with all of these, and they're fucking brilliant. Yeah. And so this also then, obviously, like, going back to building out this world, we had to think about plants and how that would express itself in this way that would keep things in this stylistic realm and lean into all of those visual tenets that we talked about in the beginning. How things like grass would showcase itself, because very quickly we realized that we were going to have a problem with high detail elements, grass, trees, hair, that would very quickly feel like they would break the style. And so how would you go about thinking about something like grass, but simplifying it down to where it gave you the impression of grass, and moved like grass, or needed to perform like grass, but without breaking the overall frame? This was another early test that we did back at Blue Sky. That again was one of those very successful ones that proved out the concept. And this break all the way down to our skies, right? Because we wanted to have this be a very consistent look, we had to make sure that it was cohesive across everything. So what would our cloud shapes be in a range of stuff, and how would they express itself? Because as soon as you start designing soft edge elements in this very hard edge, almost toon shaded world, it starts to lose the feeling of clouds. And so how we had to figure out how to actually handle that with our values and our edging and all of that, to make it feel like the tone that we needed to create, but not have it break the style. And then our materials. So this was one of those big things that we needed to build in from scratch, because we knew it was not going to be something that we could put a filter on at the beginning. And so we actually because we didn't have the budget to build these insane tools, we actually leaned on the natural filtering that your eye would do, to make sure that things would group and simplify the farther they got away from you. So we grouped our values and our colors in a way that as they receded, they would just kind of naturally mix together in the subtle realm, and then the bold colors would pop even stronger. And so it would actually give you a inherently uh, level of style into the distance without actually having to apply anything. And it was very successful, and managed to maintain our simplicity but also have the complexity that we needed when things came close to camera. And this also happened with needing to have this both in the material space, but also have this in, because of how we were thinking of this as a whole holistic frame, the grouping of elements in our world so that they almost felt like a pattern or felt like a material. So trees, grass, flowers, windows, buildings when you got far enough away, and making sure that those patterns were very clear so that they would simplify and reinforce the shape language. And so this is a good example of us and what we did to design this into something like a piece of wood, where we designed the level of detail that you see in the close-up, and as it pushed back into space, it simplified out that naturally, as your pixels kind of just got smaller, or not smaller, but your pixels stayed the same, but the data got smaller. And so it gave us the style without actually us having to build any tools for it. And this kind of became a overall piece that made us think about everything in this way of how to put things into, if it feels subtle, make it very subtle so it almost is felt but not seen. And if it feels bold, make it super bold. Because we also knew that we were going to replace geometric detail with painted textures, but we didn't want you to be able to feel the painted textures. And so there was a very, very specific balancing act between what we could actually make geometry and what we actually made painted. And so our simple one was, if it felt like it would be painted on, freckles, blush, wood grain, then it was painted on. And if it needed to be geometric, or it needed to perform in a specific way, then, and I'm going to skip ahead for a second, if it needed to perform in a specific way, then we needed to build a specific thing to do that. And so metal was a good example of this, of we needed to have it perform and react like metal, but be hyper stylized and simple so that it wouldn't break our shape language. And this was an early test that every single one of us, our brains just kind of exploded when they put this out. And it was the most amazing thing ever, because it felt so much like it landed within that sphere of, oh, fuck, it's metal and it performs like that, but it doesn't take away anything. And it's so juicy and rich. Um, and so we had to approach this with everything, because we couldn't lean into anything that was soft edges, because it would start to add implied 3D elements into the space and break the style. And so things even like hair, we had to figure out a way of building in the natural gradients that you would have on transition areas of fur, but build them with strokes so they would do the natural filtering that we talked about earlier and give you the implied gradient, but still maintain a hard edge to it. And this was with metal, obviously. This was with hair. That was the other big one, is making sure that we grouped our elements in a way that would preserve this. And so obviously color was a big, huge, important piece of our film. And so we very much leaned into the emotional space of designing our colors very purposely to reflect what we needed to say at that moment. And so we not only did this in our sets and environments, but specific ideologies. So Institute was all about white knights, white, gold, blue, the kind of classic paladin colors. And the opposite was true of the Nimona sphere, which leaned into, the salmon pink and the black and all of that. And so very quickly it kind of came to fruition where, and pulling from Nate's novel, like Nimona's salmon pink is such an important color from a story perspective. So that became a color that was extremely important throughout the film. And every time that we showcased it in a specific way, it was used to reflect um, her showing herself and being comfortable to show herself in that space. And the opposite with the colors of the Institute, where that was the illustration of non-acceptance and leaning into that and leaning into those classic spaces. And of course, this went into our lighting, where there was a very strong expression of our theme that we is kind of the biggest expression of our theme, honestly, in this entire film, where we use light and shadow to illustrate the relationship that the characters have to acceptance at that specific moment in every shot of the film. So we use kind of light, and I'll go into this into detail in a second, but we use light to showcase acceptance, but also to showcase exposure, because a lot of times when you share yourself, when you put yourself out there, you're exposing yourself, and that can be extremely scary and intimidating and all of that. And so it had that duality. And then and conversely, shadow had the duality as well, where it represented both non-acceptance, where we were literally pushing our characters into the shadows, but also it could function as safety, because it gave our characters the ability to hide themselves if that was what they needed to do or felt like they needed to do. And then at the same time, when they gave up acceptance entirely, we designed Nimona's shapeshifts to be an example of this, where Nimona, through the course of the film, gets to at her lowest low. She actually becomes a literal embodiment of this idea, where she burns into a creature of pure shadow, and a creature that actually sucks light, and light can, in takes in light, so that she can uh, be this, this character that represents what happens when you give up on acceptance entirely. And so that became a very, very powerful and very purposeful choice with how we express that idea of light and shadow through not only the lighting, but through a character itself of the shadow creature. And then conversely, when Nimona finally gets seen by Balser, she becomes the opposite. She becomes a creature of light. She becomes a creature of acceptance, and she becomes a literal sun that turns like night to day in our film. And then we also knew that we needed to balance this our hyper stylized look with the kind of subtlety and nuance of rich naturalistic lighting. And so we leaned into lens effects and, bokeh and flares and leaks and, bloom and exposure, to make sure that we balanced this and grounded this in a very rich place that, again, went back to the original idea of making sure that we started in place of leaning into those tropes of this 2D sphere to reflect the theme, and then turned it on its head in making this yes, it's an animated film, but it leans into more live action things and leans into this as not a animated film to reflect all of that. And obviously just simplifying the lighting. Sorry, I'm gonna skip this one. So this was our guide of breaking down how we actually approached the entire look of our film in regards to lighting. So we would have the graphic key light as our kind of main kind of Toon Shady-esque placeholder. We at some point we're playing around with simplified occlusion, and we still had it in a few places, but it was a very designed element, and in a lot of ways it actually came down to more of a material based thing, where we looked for areas where you would naturally have some occlusion, and we tried to paint that in a way that was almost like makeup contouring. So it would give you the impression that those forms would turn, but you would never actually see it. And so it would never hurt the overall look, but you would feel that as the character performed and moved. Um, we talked about the crease lines a little bit, but because we were blasting away so much deformation detail, we had to reinforce that. And so we put in strokes where we needed them to reinforce performance. We also, simplified the metals, simplified specularity overall. We put eye dings in all of their eyes that were shape driven to reflect the ideology that was present at that moment of the film. So if you go back and watch the movie, the shape of the eye ding at that specific moment represents what character is in power or what character ideology is in power at that time. So in the scene with Ballister when he gets thrown in jail, right? The director has the power in that scene, so everything is diamonds. The light bokeh are diamonds, the lens flares are diamonds, and the highlights in their eyes are diamonds, all to reflect that. How long did it take to create a single asset compared to creating signing multiple? A lot. We kind of had to rethink how we approached this because we knew we couldn't design um, each of each element and take as much time as we needed. And so this guide was a way of actually teaching the entire pipeline how to think in this so that we kind of pushed the responsibility out. So it wasn't just the design team, it was the modelers, it was the shader dev artists, it was the lighters, it was the animators. All of them were living in this space, and we then of course created a bunch of proprietary tools that would follow our rules, but then the computer would be the one actually propagate all of that. I hope that answered that. If not, we can talk about it more at the end. um, then we talked about the hair highlight a little bit, but that kind of simplified hair specularity for anisotropic pieces. We hinted at subsurface in certain areas, nose, eyes, or nose, ears, that kind of thing, but in a very simple way so that, again, it wouldn't add uh, 3D elements back in, implied 3D elements. And then in certain areas, we did play with a broken edge to give a little bit more visual texture to that. And then obviously leaning into things like bloom and exposure and all of those really juicy naturalistic light elements. Um, and then pretty quickly we realized that we needed to define how we were using hard edge and soft edge, because what we realized is for the consistency of this look to remain consistent, there were things that were beyond occlusion that would imply 3D-ness that we needed to make sure that we controlled. So it became us kind of looking at what those elements were. So motion blur, for example, depth of field, all of those added softness into things, gradients, blooms, atmospheric perspective, distance from camera, lots of detail grouped in specific areas and then pushed back into space. Those all kind of group together, and especially when you apply movement on top of it, to give it a more 3D feel in certain areas that we might or might not have wanted and break the style. And so we had to kind of approach everything and think of it in a holistic way to make sure that we could maintain that consistency. And so this is a page on that one. And then again, going back to that idea of light and shadow, all of our compositions were also designed to reinforce this idea. So basically, if we gave a guide that said, and this is using film reference at the time, but then we replaced it with images from the film. But if you were to say, our characters can be entirely in acceptance or partially in acceptance, and replace that with light and acceptance became interchangeable. So our characters could step into that. They could be kissed by a little of it. They could be stuck between light and shadow, acceptance and non-acceptance. They could be revealed by it. They could be moving in and out of it in a certain scene to reflect their kind of hesitation with showing themselves or not showing themselves. And we did this throughout the film. So for example, the image of Golden Loin at the bottom, that's all gold. We blew him out with exposure and color, and the entire frame is gold to reflect the weight that is being put on his shoulder of the privilege and the expectation at that moment, and the exposure that he's being felt for that, and that, you know, as an example. Um, so there was a lot of times where we kept our characters in the shadow. We had them surrounded by entirely by light or pushed entirely outside of light. I love the one of Ballister at the bottom left-hand corner, because his head just always stays below the key light, and never actually pops above it, to keep him in that space of being othered and being pushed in the shadows. We could divide them. That moment with Golden Loin and Ballister up in the rafters when they're talking. If you notice, Golden Loin will always have light on him, and Ballister only has an ambient bit, but never a direct piece of light to keep him on the threshold of, you know, revealing himself or feeling comfortable or feeling, you know, in that othered space that was so important to his character. Um, and yeah, and then we really pushed it in certain times, so where we blew away all detail with bokeh, or we pushed things all the way to black, or we, you know, there was oh, I wish I could. I wonder if I've put it in here. Probably not, because I'm an idiot. There's a shot in one of the shots in the film that I love is when the first reveal. Oh, I am an idiot. Yeah. Uh, when we first reveal the shadow creature eyes, and we push the shadow creature and the sky so far into black that we made it feel that the only way that you could see the shadow creature's back start to reveal itself is that the stars would start to be blotted out. And so it would just be black on black, and then the stars would start to disappear, because the shadow creature, which again represented that non-acceptance piece, and being pushed into that space, was blotting out more of the light and more of the acceptance as it came forward. And so, you know, we talked a little, we applied a lot of this thinking throughout, and I think we can skip through some of this stuff to get to this. So we designed our color script to be an expression of all of those ideals. So we could have moments where, if you see in the middle, there's the pink section, and that's it. We designed it to be a progression of a more kind of violet pink, and then as Nimona goes through the scene and starts to share herself and be comfortable in her, you know, for the first time with Ballister, there's a progression into Nimona pink by the end of the frame, or by the end of the sequence. And there's a couple places where we designed those kind of progressions in, where at the end of the film, we let more light into the set and push more of Nimona's color into the set as Ballister starts to, you know, literally let the light into the scene that was his and Nimona's kind of hideaway from the world. And then, you know, doing things like keeping characters at the very bottom right hand of the screen on the edge of the threshold of acceptance, and then actually having them step across that in the frame to kind of illustrate that. Let's see. And then look wise, this kind of all came together with examples of how we actually wanted to put all of these ideas together, right? And so these were a few examples of paint overs of final frames as to where we started and where we wanted to go. And then these became just the film. So, you know, starting in a much more 3D space, and how would we flatten it? How would we treat things like grass in that holistic example, that then the entire team just ran with it and iterated and pushed it and passed anything that I expected. It was amazing. And here's an early test. I think this was actually the first test we ever did on this film for Look a Picture, way back. And yeah, a few more examples of some of the early development we did to kind of bring this into the 3D space. Here was an early test of Nimona, and starting to play with stuff like the specularity and the simplification and playing with the hair and how much occlusion we want to do. And this one actually is interesting because it has a little bit more specularity and occlusion on it than we landed in the final version of this. But it was that kind of evolution from this, but planting that very strong flag even from the beginning, and also making sure that we maintained again performance and that the look did not distract from the story above all. And so, yeah, so when we got into it, we had to, these were a few examples of us really breaking down all of the elements to be aware of, and it got very granular, but like so that we could target things to pay attention to that broke the style, so that then we could give an example of this actually moving. Oh no, I forgot to add the video of this. This moves. But yeah, so example of where we started and then the target final frame of, and all of the elements that kind of came together to give us our final look. And this was, again, this was one of the most collaborative spaces I've ever worked in, because we, from day one, we knew we had such a huge ask on our plate that, like, I'm a painter. I don't know anything about tools and crypto tools and any of that kind of stuff. And so we really leaned on all of the experts to tell us what the limitations were, so that then we could build to those limitations or find a kind of a collaborative workaround. And it was the most, one of the most rewarding times in my career, because like I've never had something so collaborative that every single piece of it was thought of from the beginning and the end, and there was this amazing cross pollination that was yeah, it was really cool. And this was one of our later tests before we started into production. And that's my presentation, I think. So if you guys have any, I hope I didn't ramble too much, but if you guys have any big questions.
I don't think so. I was immersed, if that's the right word. I thought it was really cool, very insightful. Obviously, there's a lot to kind of talk about from that whole presentation. There was a lot going on. Again, if you're in the chat, please, first and foremost, yeah, let's go ahead and we're all gonna clap. You can't hear it, only because they don't have their microphones on. But normally you can hear when they're clapping. So again, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we can go through that. Aidan, we kind of skipped forward a little bit, and you addressed it a little bit at the end there. You said, I'm a painter. I don't normally do this stuff. What was your pathway to even getting to this career, like, and doing this stuff? I mean, it seems like there's so much involved in it, right? And to specialize in what exactly your title is, I mean, just looking at that presentation alone is like, okay, well, how do you even go to school for all that kind of stuff, right? There's so many different avenues. So why don't you give us a little bit of an insight on you? I know we're kind of Quentin Tarantinoing this. We probably should have done this at the beginning, but why don't you give us a little bit on insight on you, and then how you kind of got from A to, I guess, N in this point.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of funny because I was on Nimona for 7 years. We went through a lot, and I kind of had a career in just that, because I started off, when I started this movie, as just a normal artist, a concept designer, standard designer, and then Patrick, when Patrick Osborne was the director on this before Nick and Troy came on, he tapped me to do some of the character work, and then that evolved into being the character art director. And then me and Jeff Turley, who was my partner in all of this, uh, we teamed up on the look and all of this, and I focused on the character side of things, and he focused on color and look and all of this. And then eventually, when Blue Sky Closure happened, then I took over for as production designer to help with the DNEG transition piece into that sphere. So I think on this, I went from designer to production designer all in the space of, well, 7 years, so it was a very long time. But I mean, I went to school at San Jose State for animation illustration, and then I went to Blue Sky right out of school, and was started in kind of like as a color artist, and then started to realize I liked to do a bunch of different things, a little bit of character, a little bit of environment, living in the moment painting keyframe illustration space, and then just kind of growing those. And then obviously that presentation is crazy, and there was a million things to think about and keep track of, and it grew over the course of 7 years. And it was also definitely like I will say that I am a small part of this. This is literally this is a village that built this. Like, every single person on this film threw their blood, sweat, and tears into every stage of this. I mean, this film should have been killed many times. They tried to kill this thing so many different times, and it never died. And that's all a testament to all of the people who put this insane amount of work forward. So I will stand in the background and say I was a very, very small part of this. But that's kind of my rough history. And then I'm just a nerd. And so, I like looking at medieval reference and thinking about all of the socioeconomic situations that would happen if you evolve a kingdom from a cloistered, little village, and then blah, 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 blah. So, yeah, yeah.
That's awesome. It's always fun to hear that people that are the best way that I can explain is that people that are relatable are working on stuff that I love. I think that was a hard thing early on with a lot of this stuff. It was like, oh, Chad over here that plays volleyball and was in varsity and got a college scholarship for that somehow got the rights to make a Batman movie. So he's going to do that. And however that turns out is how it turns out. So we do have some questions coming in from the stream. First and foremost, we are live. This is not a recording. So if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat and we will take a look at them. So this first question right here is, can you explain how the anthropic light was applied to the 3D models on the movie?
Yeah, so our brilliant shader dev team back at Blue Sky wrote a tool that basically, oh God, I'm going to explain this very poorly. But they wrote a tool that basically drew a line that was tied to the light, and then had a specific threshold of making one side a little bit softer and one side a little bit harder, so that it would imply the directionality of where that light source was coming from. And then because it was tied, and if any of you, Nathan, or as any of you are watching, scream at me and tell me I'm doing this wrong. But from what I remember, because it was tied to the light, obviously it wasn't painted on the surface of the hair, so it would perform naturally. So if the character moved, then the hair highlight would track. If the light source moved, then the hair highlight would track. And it was awesome because there were so many of those kind of tools. How we did the metal, how we flattened and removed occlusion or things that came from occlusion. We built so many of those tools back at Blue Sky with the shader dev team there, that then we were able to actually bring those with us, and hand those over to DNEG, and then DNEG took them and made them amazing as well in that space. But that they used that tool, and then they also used a few other techniques to get the anisotropic hair highlight on that one. But
So I'm just going to take a pause before we get to these other questions. In case anyone was wondering, when Aidan called themselves an idiot earlier and then said, "No, I am an idiot," is because we have a back chat here, and I was like, "You're not an idiot." I like typed it out. In that same end, we can also garner a lot from Aidan because he just said that he was going to explain that poorly, and I had no idea what entropic light even really was, but that made perfect sense to me. I
oh,
was like,
good. It's probably
explained
wrong.
really
I
well.
guarantee you it's wrong.
Yeah, I thought that was a great explanation. So thank you for that. We have another one here from Steven. We got, how long is the design process from rough idea of a character idea to final? So I'm gonna go ahead and specify this a little bit more. So specifically for like your main characters. So
Mhm.
not your BG characters, but your Nimona and so on and so forth. From the original character conception to final, how long does that process usually take?
Yeah, so it totally depends. And it's such an interesting thing, like because I at heart am a character designer more than I think anything. It depends on the character. With Nimona, she went through a journey. Like there was the obviously there was Nate's comic and making sure that the icon of that, because Nate has a very specific style and drew the comic in a very specific style, and we explored avenues of just taking that and making it live, right? Um, but it evolved past that at a point, and it went through so many different iterations, and if it so for that process, it kind of took years, to be honest with you. And then for her, it really didn't land until we started to really lean into her personality and find out who that was, because her personality changed dramatically over different versions. Um, and then so that's like the kind of the poetic version of this, right? It's character design is such a subjective discipline, where it's like sometimes, like, what is appeal, right? No one really can put it, they just know it when they see it. And so it's the same thing for the subjective part of character design, where it took a while to get there, and for some characters it takes a while, and some characters it's like the first drawing, oh, that's them right there. I see them, I know them, I know who that character was, is all of that stuff, what their history is, and it happens. I mean, in if I was to give you a producer answer, it would probably be, you know, design should take about 2 weeks, and then full design would take another 2 weeks after that, and then the material packaging portion of it, depending on the film, um, from the design perspective, kind of took another kind of 2 weeks, but it was much longer than that. But and then obviously, like, getting it to the full 3D character and all of that, I mean, it took 7 years for that one. And sometimes it takes quicker.
7 years. Okay, so I have a question that I don't know if there's an answer to. I was just curious. Since you had obviously a lot of involvement in the characters, and even you were talking about the background characters, is there any Easter egg that you injected in, or any character that you were kind of like, oh, I'm gonna tweak this one and I'm gonna put that in there, or you just kind of like let them be as they are?
Oh, there are Easter eggs everywhere.
Oh,
I
really?
mean, the easiest one is, like, because of how we designed the BG tool, everyone just designed themselves.
Yeah,
So
nice.
like whoever had control of the tool, I'm in there. There's
Nice.
a bunch of artists in there that, like, we didn't have immense control over specific things, but, like,
Yeah.
I only wear a black t-shirt and jeans. I have a uniform, and so it was very easy to put me in there in the background. And because
Mhm.
we had a million background characters, we had to label them so everyone got a name, and so there's all of those things everywhere. I mean, from a history Easter egg, Blitzmeyer was in the original version, and we built her fully. And then a couple versions later, she was removed as a character because it didn't fit the narrative. But she's the queen. So we used her
Mm.
model as the queen, and I mean, my favorite Easter egg is the one that I'm most tied to is the Golden Loin one, which is, you know, there was obviously in the graphic novel Golden Loin's white, and when Nick and Troy came on, there was very much a desire to make sure that we push past the classic idea of why does all fantasy have to just be about white people? And so we very much, they tasked me as the character designer at the time, the character art director, to push past that. And I very selfishly wanted to make Golden Loin Asian. And so we made Golden Loin Asian. And, you know, then it was actually really cool because part of that process, and because I was using Eugene as a reference for the design, we actually cast Eugene off of the you finding him and using him for the character design and suggesting him as the casting. So that was uh it was yeah, it was very cool. So but there was a bunch. There's if you look at the uh all of those graphics that are all over the place, there's a bunch of Easter eggs in there. There's a few blue sky Easter eggs in there if you want to look around that I we put in there as especially because you know there's the whole history of you know the blue sky closure piece that was so heartbreaking for all of us on this, and making sure that we did pay homage to all of my family that you know were impacted by that obviously. Yeah.
Well,
Tom Brand.
just as a yeah, just as a piece of clarification, in case in case it didn't, Aiden saying that very selfishly made them Asian. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. Aidan Sugano, you're half Japanese. I'm quarter Japanese. We bonded over being what is called a yonsei, which is like a fourth generation Japanese American. So that's why that was said, just as like a clarification. But I think that's super cool. I mean, you know, it's always tough because there's a lot of stuff that you know, again, like in the 80s and stuff like that, it gets made, and there's always been a large conversation, even with Dungeons and Dragons, how a lot of that was just kind of like you know, just a lot of white people. And it's like, well, this is a fantasy medieval world. Why is it all, like it doesn't really make sense? But it's really cool that there's somebody like you behind the helm, just kind of making those adjustments so other people can be seen and represented, which I think is very important. Okay, so back to the questions. Let's see. Do you have any advice for practicing and developing character and environment design skills?
That's a complicated one, and I will say I am also practicing both of those things every single day and failing very, very much. No, I mean like for me, I think the thing obviously there's the draftsmanship skills, right, which are the mechanical. And then there's the thinking skills, which are the much, much more difficult things to practice. So, like, you know, I think that obviously there are many tools out for there for practicing the mechanical thing, but for the thinking piece of it, I mean, the thing that helped me the most as I was kind of along the journey of being a character designer is imbuing as much personality in the way that because we spend so much time creating these characters become real. And the quicker that you can make them become real in your head and give them reasons behind every single thing, the quicker that they become very, you know, beyond beyond your baseline and into a genuine thing, right? Like, why does that shirt fit that very specific way on that character? Well, it's because he's a little bit tall and he's always never been able to find shirts that you know, fully from fast fashion kind of thing fit his limbs or, you know, or he, you know, or they're uncomfortable. And so they have a very specific posture and mannerisms, how they hold themselves. And so like the more that you think and analyze the people around you and the reasons behind why, that would be the thing that I would say is the biggest challenge in the thing that I practice every day because we can always just draw something, right? Drawing something is almost easy. Putting a reason behind every single mark that you do is a fucking nightmare and insanely challenging, and is a task every single day of my life. So that would be my advice, if that's helpful or just opens up a box of horror as well. I don't know.
You know what I appreciate about you, Aiden, is a lot of times we talk to people that work in studios and stuff, and you have to present them with the question of imposter syndrome, right? And just talking about that, and they don't necessarily wear it on the front, and so it's like, oh man, is this person like a superhuman that they're just creating this amazing stuff and they never second guess themselves? But hearing you talk, I understand that there is a level of the self deprecating, but at the same time, it for me at least, it makes me feel seen. It makes me feel like, oh, okay, I'm not the only one, and I'm sure that there are people here watching as well that are like, oh, okay, I feel the same way, and if Aiden can be successful, then that means that I could probably do it too, right?
Oh, I have, yes, 100%. Way better than me too. I mean, I have the worst fucking imposter syndrome ever. Yeah, we're getting back into the group therapy session, which is good.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what we were doing earlier, and then we decided to turn it into a Nimona stream.
Yeah.
But let's veer back. So we have, which character was the most fun for you and the rest of the team to design? So let's start with you. Like which character was the most fun for you, and then which character would you say was the most fun for the rest of the team? Where the rest of the team was like, this is so much fun.
I mean, Nimona was obviously the funnest and the one that I got to spend the most amount of time with. And I think the thing that made her so fun was that at a certain point we got to basically use her to break all the rules. I'm pulling up something in the background to show you guys. But like she was the funnest one for me to play with, because she very quickly became a real person, to where you would be standing in a review room and would watch something happen on screen and be like, yeah, Nimona would be very embarrassed by if she was being made to do that, right? And so that was the kind of thing where it's just like, oh great, perfect, this is exactly what you want when you run into a character, where it just becomes easy to figure out what that character would do and say and all of those kind of things. And then for the team, like everyone had their own favorites, and everyone, I would say, connected to different people for different reasons. The Golden Loin was obviously like a massive popularity one at all iterations, because at the beginning he was this kind of over the top ridiculous personality, and then and in his second iteration there were a lot of us who were like, oh, back then there weren't a lot of examples of a Asian man in this kind of a role, where he's a fucking hero and he's not playing some other kind of trope. And so, and then, Ballister obviously is an easy one, but all of it, I think, is all of the characters were yeah, all of them. But I think the big ones those were the big ones.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that it wouldn't be just super fun. I mean, the project, you've already touched on it a few times, but it just seems like it was just so much fun to be a part of. Okay, so I have a question for you. And then if you know the answer, I'll have a clarification question as well. So, was there any trade digital animation in your film? So TRA hyphen digital. And then if you know the answer, for those of us that don't know, traditional digital animation in the film. Trade digital.
I mean, yes, there was definitely traditional animation in the film with the uh oh, well, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. So in the sequence where we in the subway, where we do the moving mosaic piece, that was originally a 2D piece that we very much had to figure out in 2D. because it was so locked to the rules of the tiles. And then yes, Hector, you said it right there. The Quispy, the dragon commercial, that was all 2D. Because they wanted to go after that very much like, Tony the Tiger, Frosted Flakes, 90s 90s ad. Was there anything else? Oh, and then in the credits, like one of my favorite things is the DNEG motion graphics team did all of the credits, that crazy moving credit sequence, and all of the animation pieces. All of that was traditional that they did themselves. It was yeah, blew us away.
Awesome. Okay, so now we have some portfolio questions. So I'm going to try and combine them into one super question, and I'll ask them separately, and then we'll kind of go into again like one super question.
Mhm.
So, what would you advise as far as putting together a character design oriented portfolio, turnarounds, outfits, silhouettes, so on and so forth? And then another one is, if you're creating a portfolio for biz dev concept, do you think it's better to show an ability to design a variety of subjects, or is it better to focus on one? So I guess we can do a general portfolio suggestion, and then so we have character design oriented, viz dev concept, as well as just doing a whole slew, like having a portfolio that shows all that stuff, having a portfolio that focuses on one of those things. Yeah. What are your thoughts on this, Aidan?
I mean, from a hiring perspective, like it doesn't actually matter to me. Like I think it's the play to your strength answer, which is, and the play to what you want to do. I mean, like I like to see, as someone who is this person, I like to see all of it, right? If you like to do all of it, then do all of it. If you do all of it well, then show that, because those, in my experience, like a person who can do everything and has the cross pollination of these disciplines is usually a better artist, just as a holistic piece. Because I give the example of uh, I like to put character designers on set assignments, because sometimes what you get out of them is a set that has a ton of character to it, which is exactly what you want in a set. And if you think about it just as a set, you might miss some of that if you're thinking about, well, this is exactly how the countertops are, and this is exactly what the kind of molding on this is. But like, I think the other piece of this is to be, and this is something I do for myself, is to just be very, very objectively self-reflective. Like I try to look at where my strengths and my weaknesses are, and what areas I need to build and practice and then focus on. And so for most of my career, I've been very hard on myself, obviously, if you haven't seen in this. But and so like when I run into something that I can't do, then that's, in a lot of ways for me, a challenge, and to make sure, like, all right, I'm going to bring that up because I need to practice that, because I saw that thing over there that really inspired me, and oh my God, that artist is amazing, and then I want to figure out how that person thinks and all of that. I mean, I think that would be my general answer to that, if that answered the question for that one.
I think that's a pretty succinct answer. I did have a question, just kind of your general inspiration in injecting yourself into the project, right? So obviously we have the immediate of the golden loin, right? That shift. But was there anything else? Because there's going to be your own style, your own feel, right? Even if it's not a direct style of like, this is how I draw, I'm putting this in Nimona. What other stuff, if you could give us kind of insight, did you kind of inject as far as like your own personality into Nimona?
I mean, For me, I and this let's be honest, I'll be honest with you, it lends itself to great uh being too precious at times and failure. But for me, I put myself into everything. Like because that's how I connect with this is I try to think of something that I can emotionally tie myself to. So like, Nimona is an easy one, where that character very much as soon as I saw the graphic novel kind of connected with me, and so I went back to every experience that I have ever had feeling othered, or me as a scene kid in high school, or any of those things that would help me understand this, and also would help me to add a level of depth to it, and connect to it, because we spend so much of our time and energy putting everything into the art that we do that I can't function if I don't kind of find something of myself to put in there. And it's with Ballister, I mean, I'm not going to lie. Part of the reason why he has a pompadour is to speak to, Nate's novel, but I also loved it because it spoke back to when I was obsessed with rockabilly and psychobilly in high school. And so it was like, yeah, it's like, okay, maybe we shift that design just a little bit, but like, um, the it's everything, like the background characters, the shadow creature, the design of the murder wall behind me, and one of our amazing artists, Valerie, designed this whole space. But it's fucking amazing because it's this giant, David Carson insanity on a wall, and like I fucking love that shit. And so, um, like this I think part of the reason why I stayed on this film for so long and fought so hard as much as I could was because of how much I connected to everything on this. Um, yeah.
What do
I
you think
end
are
most of
some
my
of the
answers with
big
yeah in a lame way. I'm so sorry, everyone.
Aiden, I guarantee you that we could survey every person watching right now, and they would be nothing but thankful for your time. It's been, I mean, it is still currently amazing. I did have a question that has since escaped me because I keep thinking about the pompadour aspect, and all I can think of is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I was like, hoping that that was the reason why you were like, I just love JoJo's Bizarre Adventure so much, so I had
I
to invent the
mean,
Pompadour.
listen, yeah.
So we did have a question from Cinderlin, uh, really kind of asking more about specifics of the subway scene and
Mhm.
how it worked. So integrating it into the overall scene and all that. Could you kind of get a little bit more granular with that?
Yeah, so this was one of my favorite things also. We wanted to do an homage to Charlie Harper, obviously, and he has his amazing mosaic work as an entire separate body of work. And so uh, we had the scene in the subway, obviously, where she needs to tell this backstory, and it's a gotcha, right? Because she's basically calling him out for being biased, and having a very kind of like medieval mindset to what he's grilling her about. Um, and so we were trying to figure out a way of, obviously we needed to do some flashback, right? But we wanted to ground it within the world. And so we saw one of those mass zoetrope things, and which if you can go online and look at this, like there are real ones that exist where it's in a subway and it's tile on the wall and it animates as you go past, and it's fucking amazing. And so we took that idea as we could tell it through tiles, which would speak not only the Charlie Harper piece, but it would also ground itself within this world, because we didn't want to leave. Um, I feel like a lot of us didn't want to leave this into a other place. We wanted to stay in this place because it's a very grounded story. And so that was the concept behind it. And then obviously we brought in the graffiti elements and the pipe conduit and all of those things to just kind of ground it into this space. But it was a engineering insanity because they had to figure out how, you know, to roll into this because it was all in 3D, obviously. So they had, like, it's easy to build that thing in real life. It's really hard to reverse engineer that into a completely virtual space because you need it, you know, to feel like the slow in feels right, and then at some point the registration stops and you need to put a little bit of jitter to make it feel alive and feel like it's working, and then the timing had to be worked out. And then we also, because it was a limitation of tile, we had to figure out how to animate the tiles that could perform in a way that didn't limit the performance, obviously, and make sure that we scaled the tiles to fit to that. So we had to figure out what perfect size of tiles that we could cut in half and work with the limitations of only cutting it in half, and or doing, you know, rotations and adding colors in this space so that it could animate at the right size so that you could see a smile or see an eyeball. Um, and then they had to figure out a way of transitioning into that in a crazy space using the columns of the actual subway platform and all of that. And like it was, yeah, it was a huge engineering feat that broke all of our brains. But it was also, I think it ended up beautifully because, you know, the team at DNA just blew it out of the fucking water.
I think it's really interesting because there's a lot of parts that you say, oh, it broke our brains, which leads me to my next question. What are some of the big takeaways? What are some of the big things that you obviously you were on Nimona for 7 years, so there's going to be a lot of stuff. But what would you say are like the top things that were the takeaways for you?
I mean, that is a large question.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. I mean, there's like there's the project base, and then there's kind of like in my mind there's the I don't know, life tenants base kind of thing where, like, you know, from a career perspective, from a artistic perspective, um, that project definitely challenged me to think much more granularly than I previously would have. I would also say that the thing that it taught me from a designer standpoint was, for much of my career, you know, design was its own little isolated island, but we don't make the film. We provide this small little bit in the beginning that inspires other people to make the film, put together the assets, put together the stuff, paint the stuff, animate the stuff. And so we are in service to the entire team of people that comes after us. And so making sure, for me, like I very quickly in this one wanted to lean on all of that expertise because I knew we had such a huge ask. And I think my actually, no, I mean, this is my biggest takeaway actually, which is leaning on the rest of the pipeline to educate you on how to do your job as efficiently and as um, best as you can, because that's the only way for something like this to have happened in this cohesive way. Is I, you know, you know, having the shader dev people explain to me the thinking behind this and what is complicated so that we could find a way to come to a middle ground from a creative standpoint and a tech standpoint. You know, what is challenging about um, care sim and simulation and clothing, and how can you then approach that from a design standpoint that takes those things into account, but then also maintains the artistic integrity that you want for that thing. And I think that's that place where, like, it opened up my brain a lot more to be much more expansive than it was previously, and taking in a lot more of those disciplines so that those will then influence what I do. And hopefully it means that when I do art, it can more efficiently feed the rest of the people who make the movies realistically.
Yeah, teamwork seems to be a very big thing for working on larger projects. I think we just had a stream yesterday where they were kind of mentioning that when you're in school, maybe you're working with like 2 to 3 other people, but then when you're on an actual team, that number doubles, almost triples.
Yeah.
Um, so it's good to hear that because it's always something that I think is on the back of people's minds. Like the teamwork, they're more focused on their craft, but kind of doing two things at once is always good. So separate from Nimona, just because I'm curious, you obviously worked on this animated film. I would assume that there is some love for animated films as well. Do you have some favorites that you could share with us? Like, what are some of like what you got into this obviously because you have to love some of it, right? So do you have some favorite animated films that you could share with us?
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously, like I was born and raised on everything Miyazaki. I haven't seen Boy and the Heron yet, but
Me
goddamn, I
either.
am, I
I'm
am,
ready.
I am waiting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, uh, like Lilo and Stitch was a big one for me as well. And Obviously, everything that Leica does usually is just like that. That also was breaking my brain in regards to the charm of all of that. I mean, I think those are my big ones. I mean, my Yeah, and then I like a lot of show animation, like series animation. The one that I'm obsessed with right now is Scavenger's Reign because it's
Scavenger's
just
Ring.
yeah, it's oh yeah, yeah.
So that'll be
You
homework.
go on Max and watch it. I'm plugging a completely different project right now. Go on Max and watch it. But it is the best example I have seen of the most creative and holistic world building
Mhm.
ever.
It's
Like
it's
it's
in,
fascinating.
it's interesting you bring up Miyazaki though, because there is in a good amount of his films, there's that sense of other, right? You obviously there's the easy ones to call like Porco Rosso, right? He's literally a pig-faced man. Um, and then Howl's Moving Castle. There's a lot of relatability there, so that's really interesting to hear that. And then you actually get to work on Nimona, so kind of what a transition, right? Uh, and yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Miyazaki as well. My grandmother used to take me to see. Um,
Mine
there's
too.
a yeah, yeah, R.I.P. to our bachans, or at least mine. um, yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for all that. Oh, sorry, I'm being told by Octavio to say, hey, tell him that I'm very grateful for this talk. So Octavio specifically is very grateful for this talk.
I'm very grateful that I got to do this. This was awesome. Thank you so much for all of you guys giving me your time as well.
Yeah, I mean it's exceptional to have you here, not only to talk about what you talked about, your project Nimona, but again, there is a level, at least for me, talking about that sense of other. Growing up, if I told myself that I was going to be talking to people professionally about cartoons, I think my 10-year-old self would have looked at me and been like, dude, I was getting thrown into trash cans for trying to talk to people about anime. So now just coming full circle and then meeting you and sitting here and going through this has just been it's been really good for my soul. And I understand we're also a school that we're working on stuff, but it's so great to be able to talk to people like you. It's awesome to have all of you in the chat that are also feeling that same kind of energy. This has been an amazing stream. They're all amazing streams. To everyone else who has ever been on the stream, they're all amazing. They're all super fun. But this has been really great. So we really really do appreciate you. Now, finally, if people want to get to know more about you or follow you, or like if you were going to have a class come up or anything like that, where would they go to stay up to date with you?
Oh, I have no idea. I was telling you this earlier. I'm the worst at social media. Yeah, you can try to go on my Instagram. I'm absolutely atrocious. Uh, probably my Instagram.
Well, what's your phone number? We'll put that up right now. No, I'm
Oh,
joking.
okay. Yeah. Oh, actually, I did notice. I will say this. I will plug this. Uh, Someone in the chat very early on mentioned that our art book is our digital art book is out. It has a bunch of stuff on there. I don't know what the link is off the top of my head, but if there's anything on this presentation that you had questions about, go there, because all of the imagery that I showed is in that book. And it should be, I don't remember. It's, oh, there we go.
Looks like artofnimona.com, maybe. Oh yeah,
that's right. Yeah, it's off of Cartoon Brew.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, oh, Cartoon Brew. There we go. Awesome. So Octavio, this is the digital book right here, cartoonbrew.com, that whole link right there. And then if people want to try and get a hold of you, they can try and go on Instagram and hopefully they can get their hooks in you. And then
I promise I will try to answer.
And if you're interested in finding out what Gnomon can do for you, you can always contact us at www.gnomon.edu. And thank you again so much, Aidan, for stopping by. We cannot wait to have you back. Oh, hang on, wait. We can't tell it, but someone say the exhibit will be at Gallery Nucleus for 1 week starting on Sunday.
I will be at Gallery Nucleus on Sunday. See, I'm
all right.
I told you.
Awesome.
And it'll be up for the Nimona piece will be up for a week, and it'll be me and Nate talking, I think, on Sunday as well. So that'll be fun.
Wait, you're gonna be at Gallery Nucleus on Sunday, and we're just finding out about. So if you're,
I told you I'm the worst.
If you're in the area, and it's in Alhambra, so if you're in Alhambra and you're looking for a shabu shabu, and then you also want to go to an art gallery, you can go to Shibuya, and then you can head to Gallery Nucleus, and that sounds like a great day to me. I think I'm actually going to stop by. I think it'd be fun to hang out. All right, and then anyone else here, if you want to stop by, please stop by. And that's it. That was our whole stream. I mean, I feel like we could talk for hours, but we're going to let Aidan go, and we're going to let you all go. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.